Hello, I'm Donna McElligott. In the news at this hour, today history was made as Hong Kong reverted to Chinese rule after 156 years under the British. Celebrations, speeches, tears of both joy and sadness ruled the day. Earlier, outgoing Governor Chris Patten left his Hong Kong residence. His farewell speech looked not to the future, but rather focused on the past and what the British brought to Hong Kong.
As British administration ends, we are, I believe, entitled to say that our own nation's contribution here was to provide the scaffolding that enabled the people of Hong Kong to ascend. The rule of law, clean and light-handed government, the values of a free society, the beginnings of representative government and democratic accountability. This is a Chinese city, a very Chinese city with British characteristics. No dependent territory has been left more prosperous.
And there are others still gearing up for their arrival in China's Hong Kong. China's People's Liberation Army is getting ready to move across the border. They'll be taking up posts in Hong Kong within a few hours. People gathered to wave goodbye to the soldiers. 4,000 soldiers will be arriving by land, air, and sea and will bring armed personnel carriers, helicopters, and ships. In Britain, reaction to the handover is mixed. Some are celebrating, some are worried, others are indifferent, and predictions abound, not only among the soothsayers, but in the financial district, where they're crossing fingers hoping everything goes smoothly. Anne McMillan reports.
For most of the Chinese community in London, the Hong Kong handover is a cause for celebration.
We love to see that the British would hand over Hong Kong to China.
Actually, we are Chinese and we're back to our homeland.
A three-day festival is being held to mark the historic event. But as the UK Beijing Chinese Orchestra performed on stage, some members of the audience were pessimistic.
Hong Kong Chinese are obviously part of China, but I don't think you can have one nation, two systems. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Simon Wong, a fortune teller, is doing booming business at the festival, but probing questions from Patricia Rothery got non-committal answers.
Are there going to be difficulties?
I think first will be a little bit difficulty, and later they will be okay.
As crowds watch the handover ceremonies in London's Chinatown, it's not just fortune tellers who are making predictions about Hong Kong's future. Britain's financial community is also hedging its bets. Britain accounts for 1/3 of all foreign investment in Hong Kong, about $200 billion. Analysts expect some volatility in the next few months, but they're predicting continued economic growth in the long term. Anne McMillan, CBC News, London.
Thousands of people gathered in Paris this morning to honor the late Jacques Cousteau. The undersea explorer died last week at the age of 87. Paul Workman has our report.
This is an honor reserved for only a few in France. Mass at Notre Dame Cathedral. Jacques Cousteau was perhaps the most famous Frenchman in the world, certainly one of the most respected. French President Jacques Chirac led the mourners. Typically, one of Cousteau's last crusades was against Chirac's nuclear testing in the South Pacific. The Mass was given by the Archbishop of Paris, Jean-Marie Lustiger. Cousteau, he said, was a poet who exposed reality.
Il a fait découvrir à l'humanité entière.
He made the world discover the immense universe of the sea, he said. Cousteau's life was a grand exploration. He wandered the oceans as a filmmaker, teacher, and ecologist, making famous movies, scolding world leaders for not doing enough to save the planet. Cousteau had millions of admirers. Today in Paris, a few hundred stood outside Notre Dame.
He was to the earth what a doctor is to a man.
Il parlait pour la nature.
He spoke for nature, she says, truly an ecologist above politics, an exceptional man. Cousteau's coffin was carried out of the church by sailors from the Calypso, the converted British minesweeper that became his home on the sea. He'll be buried Thursday in the family grave in southwest France. Paul Workman, CBC News, Paris.
The Somalia inquiry report is being presented to the federal government today, but the Commission and the government have agreed it won't be released to the public until Wednesday. The inquiry was called after the 1993 torture and killing of a Somali teenager by members of the Canadian Airborne Regiment. But in January, the government suddenly ordered the hearings to end by March 30th and a final report to be delivered by today. The case of the Charlottetown bomber is closed. This morning, Roger Charles Bell was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Bell pleaded guilty to planting 4 bombs over the past 9 years. The most recent bombing took place at a propane station in Charlottetown last year. He also targeted the PEI legislature in 1995, where 1 man was injured. The 2 other incidents took place at the Charlottetown courthouse in 1988 and at a Halifax park in 1994. This morning, Bell apologized to the man hurt by the bomb outside Province House and to others he had frightened. Canada's economy showed some improvement in April. Gross domestic product rose 0.8%, following a drop in March. The GDP advance was accompanied by a gain in employment. The number of jobs created in April and May was slightly higher than in the first 3 months of the year. A half a dozen Eaton stores are closing their doors permanently today. 4 are in Ontario: Toronto, Brantford, Kitchener, and Sarnia. The other 2 are in Montreal and Victoria. Eaton's eventually expects to end up with about 55 stores, down from 85, as it struggles under bankruptcy protection. The saying goes that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. If that's the case, a recent survey of Canadian youth shows we're in for a lot of reruns. The Angus Reid poll quizzed 1,100 Canadians between the ages of 18 and 24 on their knowledge of Canadian history. 81% failed. The poll has a margin of error of plus or minus 19 times out of 20. Laurie Graham has more.
The survey consists of 30 questions, and we decided to test some university students. It's a good thing their final grade didn't count. Most of them failed.
It covered more knowledge than I learned in high school or like in elementary school.
A lot of the stuff I should know, very important, but I just don't.
In the survey, 36% of young Canadians knew that Confederation occurred in 1867. Only 16% could name Mark Garneau as the first Canadian in space, and 30% thought Norman Rockwell was Canadian.
It says that they watch American television, that they are tuned into American cultural icons, that their interests are continent-wide rather than Canadian.
Overall, the results show that Alberta scored the highest with an average of 40%, while BC and Ontario tied for second at 37%. And Quebec was the worst, averaging only 28%. But Quebec students know the history of their own province. 79% of them knew that Canada's first Francophone Prime Minister was Wilfrid Laurier, and 74% knew that Great Britain defeated France on the Plains of Abraham.
It was kind of sad that, you know, there was a national average a little better than 1/3 getting receiving a passing grade.
Rudyard Griffiths commissioned this study.
This is one of our key objectives, which is to reintroduce Canadians to the values, beliefs, and traditions that have made this country great.
Students here agree that history is important, but they say they're too busy concentrating on their futures to think about the past. Laurie Graham, CBC News, Toronto.
This year is supposed to be a good one for sockeye salmon on the Fraser River in BC, but weekend testing shows that the early returns may be too low to fish. The warning comes from the Fraser River panel of the Pacific Salmon Commission. I'm Donna McKelligot. Those were the hour's top stories from CBC News.
Hi, I'm Jeannie Lee in Toronto with this hour's look at business news. The flag of China now flies over Hong Kong, and in these first few hours, the priority will be parties and celebrations to mark the handover. But there are some sobering questions, of course, including will it be business as usual after? Lately, the usual has meant brisk, booming business. Take the stock market. The Hang Seng Index closed at a record high on Friday, and the real estate market, property prices are going to the moon in Hong Kong, up 25% so far this year in some areas. And Hong Kong's jobless rate is less than 3%. The gross domestic product per capita is higher than in Canada, the UK, and Australia. And in a recent poll, American executives voted Hong Kong as the easiest place in the world to do business. That's a title that it couldn't capture until this year, and that was because of those handover clouds above, clouds which have cleared as this historic date has approached. Now a check of the markets. And on this awkward day of business squeezed between a weekend and a holiday Tuesday, not many players are bothering with the markets. The TSE 300 in Toronto has slipped into the minus side, down 9 points to 64.17, with most sectors just lazing around, really. Things slow in New York as well. Investors waiting for tomorrow's Federal Reserve meeting. Strong consumer spending and home sales have bonds weaker, and that's got the Dow off 26 points to 76.61. And London had a volatile day to start what some expect to be a volatile week, budget week. The FTSE 100 sagged by 36 points to 46.04. Tokyo, meanwhile, suffered another brokerage scandal, but rumors had been swirling about that for a while, and demand for other stocks pushed the Nikkei higher by 81 points. And Hong Kong, of course, was closed for the handover holiday. The Canadian dollar is at 72.45 cents US, close to where it's been hovering in the last few days since the Bank of Canada moved the bank rate higher. Bonds, Canadian 10-years are down 75 cents. US 30-year bonds are off 2/3 of a point. And in commodities, gold keeps suffering, down $2.40 an ounce to just over $334 an ounce right now, the lowest it's been in over 4 years. Big returns in stocks have even more investors bailing out of gold. Silver is down 7 cents, and oil has slipped 16 cents a barrel. That's this hour's check of the markets. I'm Jeannie Lee.